Fire survivors know things that safety pamphlets will never print. 31 confessions, none of them comfortable. Let's get into it. 1. Every school drill enforces it. Every fire safety poster confirms it, and every parent has repeated it with absolute confidence. Get low, stay low, crawl under the smoke. It sounds like airtight logic. Cooler air sits near the floor. Toxic smoke rises to the ceiling, so you drop down and crawl to safety. There is just one problem with this gospel, and it is a fatal one. The floor of a modern structure fire is frequently the most chemically lethal layer in the entire room, and the advice you memorized in second grade was built for a home that no longer exists. Here is what changed. The average American home in the 1970s was furnished primarily with wood, cotton, and wool. It burned slowly. It produced recognizable smoke, and the legacy fire behavior research that generated the crawl low instruction was calibrated to that environment. Today, your sofa is polyurethane foam. Your carpet is nylon. Your blinds are plastic, and your mattress is a layered synthetic composite. When those materials combust, they do not produce the same smoke your grandparents' furniture did. They off-gas hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, and a chemical cocktail that stratifies at floor level at concentrations that are lethal within 2 to 3 breaths. The Underwriters Laboratories Fire Safety Research Institute conducted landmark burn studies between 2012 and 2019 that compared identically sized rooms furnished with legacy materials versus modern synthetics. The results were not subtle. A modern furnished room became unsurvivable in as little as 3 minutes from ignition. A legacy room took approximately 17 minutes to reach the same state. The floor layer in modern fire conditions frequently carries a heavier concentration of toxic gases than the mid-room air above it. Survivors of major California wildfires and the 2003 Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island reported that rooms became chemically uninhabitable long before visible flames blocked the exits. Toxicology on Station nightclub victims confirmed that hydrogen cyanide poisoning was a primary cause of rapid incapacitation. Not flame, not heat, not ceiling-level smoke. The National Fire Protection Association has quietly updated professional training materials to reflect the modern fuel load reality. The public-facing crawl low message has not caught up. It remains dominant in school curricula across all 50 states. You spent decades memorizing a survival technique optimized for a home that no longer exists. The floor is not a sanctuary. It is just a closer seat to the chemistry experiment that is already trying to kill you. 2. The assumption that keeps people from taking bedroom smoke alarms seriously is embarrassingly simple. You will smell the smoke before it gets bad. You will wake up, and you will have time to get out. It feels true because the nose is obviously a detection organ, and fire obviously has a smell, so the math seems to check out. The math is wrong, and the gap between this belief and documented fire behavior has been quietly killing people in their sleep for decades. The problem begins with basic sleep physiology. Human olfactory sensitivity decreases by 50 to 100% during deep sleep stages. The brain's arousal threshold for smell is dramatically higher during sleep than during waking hours, and combustion byproducts produced in the early stages of a residential fire do not trigger that arousal response anyway. What does suppress it aggressively and silently is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is produced by incomplete combustion in virtually every structure fire. It is completely odorless, and it does not smell like anything at all, because it is a gas, not a particle. At the concentrations that accumulate in a burning residential structure, it actively suppresses the central nervous system, deepening sleep rather than disrupting it. Sleeping victims inhale increasing concentrations without any arousal response whatsoever. Fire investigation reports from the National Fire Protection Association consistently document victims found in bedrooms with no defensive posture. They never stirred, never turned over, never reached for a phone. The carbon monoxide reached them before the smoke did, and they never knew the difference. Roughly 50% of all residential fire deaths in the United States occur between 11 at night and 7 in the morning. That statistic is not a coincidence. It is the direct consequence of a population that believes its nose is its early warning system. The NFPA reports that approximately 3 of every 5 home fire deaths occur in structures with no smoke alarm or a non-functioning one, a number driven almost entirely by the cultural complacency this myth enables. Alcohol compounds the problem further. Studies show that intoxicated sleepers fail to respond to smoke alarm tones at meaningful rates, let alone to odor cues that are not reaching them at all. Survivors who escaped nighttime fires describe a consistent and striking detail. They did not smell anything. They woke to the alarm, to extreme heat, to a crashing sound, never to smoke. Your nose is a decorative feature that clocks out at bedtime. The alarm on your ceiling is the only early warning system you actually have, and millions of Americans treat it like a low-priority appliance they will replace eventually. 3. The evacuation instinct is almost never clean. Something always pulls at you on the way out. The phone charging on the nightstand, the medication on the counter, the documents in the drawer, the pet in the back bedroom. There is a reflexive internal negotiation that happens in the first seconds of a fire emergency, and it sounds entirely reasonable. It will take 30 seconds. The exit is right there. I know exactly where it is. That negotiation is the single most documented behavioral contributor to fire deaths in residential settings. And the reason it persists is that the true timeline of a modern house fire is so far outside most people's intuitive model that the math never feels real until it is too late. The Underwriters Laboratories research that dismantled the crawl low myth also produced a number that should reframe every fire safety conversation happening in America right now. A modern furnished home can transition from ignition to full room involvement, the point fire engineers call flashover, in under 3 to 5 minutes. Legacy homes from the mid-20th century took 14 to 17 minutes to reach the same state. The entire behavioral framework of residential fire escape was constructed around the slower timeline. The survival window that framework assumed still exists has been compressed by more than 2/3 by the synthetic material revolution in American home furnishing. Flashover is not a gradual process. It is instantaneous and total. The moment every combustible surface in a room simultaneously ignites from radiant heat, and the environment transitions from survivable to unsurvivable in a fraction of a second. There is no navigating through a post-flashover room. There is only passing through fire. Post-fire investigations consistently find victims within 10 to 20 feet of a viable exit, having been delayed by object retrieval or attempted re-entry for another person. This finding has appeared in NFPA residential fire investigations across 3 consecutive decades. In the Lahaina, Hawaii fire of 2023, the deadliest American fire since 1918, with 102 people killed. Survivor accounts describe the fire's advance as faster than vehicle traffic could escape. People who paused for belongings in the initial minutes were the most severely injured. The NFPA's 2-minute escape messaging was built on legacy fire data and has not been formally updated in official public campaigns. The things you planned to grab became the reason you stayed. A fire in a modern home does not offer a grace period. It offers a countdown, and the clock started before you smelled anything. 4. If a building passed inspection and was constructed after the major code overhauls, the working assumption is that it is meaningfully fire resistant. The codes exist, inspectors signed off, the certificate is on file. You are protected. This belief is understandable, and it is also responsible for a category of structural fire outcomes that consistently surprises occupants, baffles families, and occasionally kills firefighters who did not expect a building to fail as fast as it did. The variable most people do not know to think about is not whether a building is new. It is how that building was built. Older structures used old-growth solid wood joists, beams that, when exposed to fire, char predictably on the outside and maintain structural integrity for a significant period. The char layer actually acts as thermal insulation for the interior wood. Fire engineers have a name for this: fire endurance. It is a measurable, engineered property, and older heavy timber construction has a lot of it. Modern construction uses engineered lumber, I-joists, parallel strand beams, laminated truss systems that achieve the same load-bearing specifications at a fraction of the material cost and weight. The problem is the adhesive. The resins and glues that hold engineered lumber components together fail at temperatures well below wood ignition, approximately 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. When those adhesives fail, the structural member does not char and hold. It collapses, suddenly and completely. Firefighters have a name for these components too: widowmakers. The National Institute of Standards and Technology documented that lightweight wood frame floor systems can fail in as little as 6 minutes of fire exposure. Legacy solid wood systems held for 18 to 20 minutes under comparable conditions. The NFPA and underwriters' laboratories have issued specific safety advisories, warning firefighters to assume faster collapse timelines in post-1980 construction. Those advisories do not exist for legacy buildings because the legacy buildings do not fail the same way. Meanwhile, the majority of U.S. states do not require sprinkler systems in new single-family residential construction, a gap the home building industry has maintained through decades of successful lobbying by framing sprinkler requirements as cost burdens. Fire-rated drywall and code-compliant insulation protect the building envelope from exterior penetration, but have no meaningful effect on the synthetic furniture, flooring, and finishes that constitute the actual fuel load inside. The inspection sticker is a document about construction methods. It is not a promise about how long the floor holds once things go wrong. The code was written by committees. The fire did not read it. 5. Closing a door during a fire is actually right. This is one of the few pieces of mainstream fire safety advice that is correct, which makes it more dangerous than if it were simply wrong, because people apply the right principle with the wrong mental model and end up with a false sense of protection that the door they are relying on cannot provide. The principle is sound. Underwriters' laboratories burn experiments, conducted as part of the Close Before You Doze campaign, demonstrated that a closed solid core door reduced room temperatures from over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit to under 100 degrees on the protected side, and maintained survivable oxygen levels for significantly extended periods compared to a room with an open doorway. The mechanism is simple. The door cuts off the fire's airflow and slows the migration of both heat and toxic gases into the refuge space. What that campaign could not fix is the construction reality sitting behind the principle. The critical variable is door type, and it is one that most American homeowners have never considered. Hollow core interior doors, the standard in modern residential construction since the 1960s, fail in approximately 1 to 2 minutes of direct fire exposure. Solid core doors hold for 20 minutes or more. From the inside of your bedroom, these two doors are visually indistinguishable. They feel identical when you close them. They perform categorically differently when there is fire in the corridor. In apartment building fires, documented cases exist of residents who sheltered in place behind closed hollow core doors and waited for rescue, having made the correct procedural decision with an incorrect assumption about the protection it provided. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in 1977 demonstrated how rapidly fire moves through interconnected structures when interior doors are inadequate or left open. Modern fire investigation protocols now include door position analysis as a standard component of post-incident review. Whether a victim's door was open or closed at time of death has become one of the strongest predictors of outcome in residential fire fatalities. Survivors who successfully sheltered behind doors added critical steps that most people do not know to pair with the closed door. Sealing the gap with clothing or towels, signaling from a window, staying near the door to monitor heat. The closed door is right. Believing that any door is a firewall is not. What is between you and the fire is often a panel of compressed cardboard with a decorative finish. Know what you are actually working with. 6. The most cinematic survival move in the entire fire safety playbook is punching through a window, clearing the frame, and dropping into fresh air. Every action movie has certified this as the correct instinctive response, and the image is so deeply embedded that most people would attempt it without a second thought. The reality is that breaking a window in an active fire scenario introduces oxygen into a fuel-rich, oxygen-limited environment in a way that can cause immediate and explosive fire intensification, potentially accelerating the very conditions you are trying to escape. Modern residential fires burn in what fire researchers call a ventilation-limited state. There is plenty of fuel, but the fire is constrained by the available oxygen. Introduce a fresh air source through a broken window, and you create what Underwriters Laboratories research describes as flow path intensification. The fire accelerates dramatically toward the new oxygen supply, which may be the direction you are currently standing. UL experiments demonstrated that opening a window on the fire floor caused temperature increases of 400 to 700 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds in adjacent spaces, and could trigger flashover in rooms that were previously survivable. The physics of creating a sudden air opening does not care about your intentions. Second, the mechanics of breaking modern residential glass are not what movies suggest. Tempered safety glass, standard in most contemporary construction, does not yield to a fist punch. It requires a sharp, focused impact on an edge or corner with an object harder than a human hand. Documented survivor accounts include significant hand and wrist injuries from failed window breaking attempts in actual fire scenarios. Third, in high-rise buildings, broken windows create vertical stack effect airflow that pulls smoke upward through the building, affecting floors above the fire. This dynamic was a documented factor in the 1980 MGM Grand Hotel fire in Las Vegas, where 85 people died, and upper floor victims were overcome by smoke that traveled through vertical pathways created by building ventilation and broken windows. The correct protocol, taught in firefighter training but almost entirely absent from public safety communication, is to break a window only as an absolute last resort when you are prepared to immediately escape through it, and only when the fire is definitively not between you and outside air. Fire investigators classify self-ventilation by occupants as a contributing factor in multiple fatality cases. The window is not a door. It is a valve the fire is extremely interested in. Before you break it, understand that you are not just letting yourself out. 7. The alarm goes off, and you have time to get everyone out. This is the entire premise of residential fire safety communication in the United States for the past 50 years. Install the alarm, hear it, evacuate. Simple, scalable, and built on an assumption that modern fire conditions have quietly, systematically destroyed. In a modern furnished home, a smoke alarm functioning exactly as designed, activating at the first detectable particle, may still only provide occupants 90 seconds or less before the environment becomes unsurvivable. That is not a failure of the alarm. It is a failure of the gap between alarm and escape to match the timeline of modern fire behavior. The Underwriters Laboratories study that exposed this reality found that working smoke alarms in modern furnished homes provided a median escape time of approximately 3 minutes from first alarm, compared to 17 minutes in legacy furnished rooms. In worst-case scenarios, that window was under 90 seconds. The alarm worked. The fuel load eliminated the margin. Alarm type compounds the problem. Ionization, smoke alarms, the most common type sold at hardware stores across the country, are optimized for fast flaming fires and are notoriously slow to detect smoldering fires. Smoldering fires are the category most likely to occur at night in upholstered furniture, which is the precise scenario where sleeping occupants are most vulnerable. Photoelectric alarms detect smoldering fires significantly faster. Most homes have ionization alarms because they are cheaper and were standardized first. The U.S. Fire Administration reports that nearly half of home fire deaths occur in homes that had functioning smoke alarms. The alarm activated. People still died. The gap between alarm and unsurvivable conditions was shorter than their escape required. Survivor accounts from fast-moving fires describe alarm activation and flashover as nearly simultaneous events in multiple documented cases. The recommended preparedness complement to alarm installation, 2 exits from every room, practiced family escape plan, designated outdoor meeting point, is printed on official materials. The NFPA estimates that fewer than 30% of American households have practiced a fire escape plan in the past year. Children present a specific vulnerability. Standard alarm tones have demonstrated reduced effectiveness in waking children compared to voice alarms. A finding with meaningful implications for families who assume the alarm alone covers their sleeping household. The alarm did its job. The gap between the alarm sounding and you standing safely outside is a distance you have to cover in seconds. If you have never practiced it, you have never actually prepared. You have just installed a device that will accurately narrate the emergency. 8. The mental image of sprinkler systems is consistent and universal. A small fire triggers every sprinkler head in the building, drenching carpets, destroying electronics, flooding the server room, and turning a manageable fire incident into a waterlogged catastrophe. This image is so durable that it has functioned as the single most effective argument against mandatory residential sprinkler requirements for decades, successfully blocking legislation in the majority of American states, while the home construction industry deployed it in lobbying campaigns and consumer-facing objections. The image is also almost entirely fictional. Automatic sprinkler systems are thermally activated individually at the head level. Each sprinkler head contains either a fusible link or a glass bulb filled with glycerin solution that is rated to burst at a specific temperature, typically between 135 and 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Only a head that reaches that temperature activates. In a typical fire scenario, that means one head, occasionally 2, directly above or adjacent to the fire. In roughly 90% of documented sprinkler activations, a single head controls or extinguishes the fire completely. The rest of the building's heads never activate because the rest of the building's air never reaches the activation threshold. The NFPA reports that in buildings with functioning sprinkler systems, the death rate per 1,000 reported fires is 87% lower than in unsprinklered buildings. That number is staggering, and it is almost entirely unknown to the general public, which is still operating on the flooded building image from decades of industry-funded counter-narrative. The actual water volume from a single activated sprinkler head averages 15 to 25 gallons per minute. A firefighting hose line delivers over 150 gallons per minute. The water damage from one sprinkler head is substantially less than the water damage from the fire department's response to the fire that the sprinkler would have prevented. Accidental activation rates for properly maintained residential sprinklers are approximately 1 in 16 million heads per year. The Station nightclub fire, the Happy Land social club fire. In New York in 1990, 87 dead, and the MGM Grand Hotel fire all occurred in buildings without functioning sprinkler coverage in the relevant spaces. Survivors of sprinklered building fires describe the activation as disorienting, but universally credit the system with keeping conditions survivable. The sprinkler system is not a flood. It is a targeted response. The reason your house does not have one is not safety math. It is a lobby that convinced you water damage was scarier than fire. 9. 3 words. Stop, drop, and roll. Memorized before age 7 by virtually every American alive today, drilled into elementary school curricula with the certainty of arithmetic, and universally considered foundational fire survival knowledge. None of that is wrong exactly. The technique is physiologically correct. The problem is that 3 words are doing the work of a paragraph, and the missing paragraph is where the actual survival information lives. The technique requires immediate cessation of running. The instinctive, overwhelming response to being on fire. Because running fans the flames and feeds oxygen to the burning surface. In documented clothing fire incidents, most adults run for several critical seconds before attempting to stop. Those seconds extend burn surface and severity in ways that are not recoverable. The rolling itself must be deliberate, must cover the face to prevent inhalation of flame, and must be vigorous enough to actually smother combustion on the clothing surface. A 2014 American Burn Association review found that a significant percentage of stop, drop, and roll attempts did not fully extinguish the fire, primarily because rolling was insufficient to smother flames on loose or synthetic fabrics that reignite readily once the smothering pressure is removed. Children who are on fire instinctively run toward adults. The adult instinct is to grab them. Both responses are wrong because grabbing a child whose clothing is burning can transfer flames to the adult. The correct response: smother with a non-synthetic fabric, then assist with drop and roll, is almost never taught alongside the 3-word instruction. In wildfire survivor scenarios, the stop, drop, and roll framework encounters terrain that makes it inapplicable. Dropping onto burning ground, sparse cover, and active ember fall. The conditions campfire and car fire survivors faced in 2018 requires different adaptations entirely, including rapid clothing removal and terrain-based protection strategies that no school curriculum addresses. Synthetic performance fabrics present a specific failure mode the original instruction did not account for. Polyester and nylon melt and bond to skin during fire exposure. Rolling spreads melted material rather than smothering it. Smothering with a heavy, non-synthetic fabric is the correct response to a synthetic clothing fire, and that distinction exists nowhere in the public-facing instruction. Survivors who successfully self-extinguished clothing fires overwhelmingly used water, soil, or heavy fabric to smother. Adaptations learned in the moment, not taught before it. Stop, drop, and roll is not wrong. It is 3 words doing the work of a paragraph, and that missing paragraph is where the actual survival information lives. 10. People request lower hotel floors, avoid high-rise apartment buildings, and carry a baseline anxiety about being many stories up when a fire could cut off the staircase below them. The logic feels airtight. Height equals distance from the ground, which equals distance from rescue, which equals more danger. This calculation is wrong in almost every scenario that does not involve a catastrophic structural failure, and it leads to behavioral choices that can be more dangerous than the height itself. In properly constructed high-rise buildings, the floors above a fire are frequently among the safest places to be, and the decision to evacuate downward through smoke-compromised stairwells kills more people than sheltering in place in correctly assessed upper floors. High-rise construction requires fire-rated floor assemblies, pressurized stairwells, compartmentalized floor-to-floor separation, and sprinkler systems that simply do not exist in low-rise construction. The building is engineered as a series of fire-resistive compartments designed to contain a fire to its floor of origin, while maintaining survivable conditions above and below. The most dangerous fire scenario in a high-rise is vertical smoke migration through elevator shafts, stairwells, and mechanical chases, which primarily affects upper floor occupants who are evacuating into the smoke column by using the very stairwells the smoke is traveling through. Staying in a floor-level refuge with intact door integrity routinely produces better outcomes than descent through compromised stairwells. The One Meridian Plaza fire in Philadelphia in 1991 burned for 19 hours and killed 3 firefighters. Floors above the fire that maintained compartmentalization were not significantly affected. The fire burned through unsprinklered floors and stopped at a floor that had been retrofitted with sprinklers. The first Interstate Bank fire in Los Angeles in 1988 consumed 4 floors of a 62-story building. Occupants above who sheltered in place survived. The practical reach of a fire department aerial ladder is approximately 7 to 10 stories. Above that, ladder rescue is not possible regardless of floor. Helicopter rescue is constrained by wind, smoke, rooftop access, and structural conditions. For occupants above the ladder reach threshold, structural sheltering and signaling is frequently the only viable option. World Trade Center is often cited as counter-evidence to all of this. It should not be, because catastrophic structural failure from aircraft impact and prolonged fuel fire is categorically different from every other high-rise fire scenario that has ever occurred. The floor number on your hotel key is not your survival ranking. High-rises have fire engineers who spent careers on compartmentalization. The dangerous assumption is that evacuation is always the answer. 11. It is a fire. You have a car. The math looks obvious. Drive away, outpace the flames, reach safety. Hundreds of thousands of Americans living in wildland-urban interface communities operate on exactly this calculation, and it is responsible for a category of wildfire deaths that is as predictable as it is preventable. In extreme wildfire conditions, the low humidity, high wind, dry fuel scenarios that produce mass casualty events, vehicle evacuation routes do not function as escape corridors. They function as kill zones, and the window between a road appearing viable and a road being impassable is measured in single-digit minutes. The Camp Fire in Paradise, California, in November of 2018 killed 85 people and remains the deadliest California wildfire in recorded history. The majority of those deaths occurred on evacuation routes. Burned vehicles were found on roads that, by all visual indicators, should have been passable minutes before the fire front arrived. The fire front did not arrive the way the occupants expected. Under the wind conditions present during the Camp Fire, gusts between 35 and 50 miles per hour, the fire traveled faster than vehicle traffic could move through a clogged 2-lane evacuation corridor. Radiant heat from an approaching wildfire front at 100 feet distance can exceed 80 kilowatts per square meter, sufficient to ignite vehicle upholstery, crack windshields, and melt tires before the visible flame arrives. Vehicles become ovens before they become fires. CAL FIRE post-incident analysis documented a phenomenon called spotting. Embers carried up to a mile ahead of the main fire front that ignite separate fires with no visual warning from the direction of the main advance. The Lahaina, Hawaii fire in 2023, which killed 102 people, produced the same evacuation route dynamic. A single main corridor serving a coastal community with limited exit options became gridlocked within minutes of fire encroachment. Early evacuees escaped. Anyone who delayed by 15 to 20 minutes found a compromised or closed route. Survival in vehicle entrapment scenarios, where escape is no longer possible, involves covering all vents, getting below window level, and protecting skin with natural fiber material. This information appears in no standard evacuation guidance given to WI residents. The U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE both document that voluntary early evacuation at the first watch notification, before mandatory orders, is the single highest survival behavioral action in wildfire events. By mandatory order, the window is frequently already narrowing. Your car is not an escape vehicle. It is a metal box that sits in traffic. The people who survived left before anyone told them to. 12. The fire department is coming. The 911 call is placed. The professional response is activated, and the cultural assumption is that this constitutes rescue. That help will arrive before the situation becomes unsurvivable. This belief is not cynical to examine. It is not an attack on fire departments. It is a factual mismatch between response timelines and modern fire behavior timelines that kills people because it allows them to wait when they should be moving. The NFPA standard for fire department response, NFPA 1710, calls for a 4-minute response time in urban areas from dispatch to arrival. The national average actual response time is 7 minutes. In rural areas, it commonly exceeds 14 minutes. From ignition in a modern furnished home, flashover can occur in 3 to 5 minutes. By the time the statistical average response arrives, the room of origin is already past survivable conditions in many scenarios. The call is placed. The response is appropriate and professional. The building is already past the threshold where interior survival is possible in the fire room. Volunteer fire departments serve approximately 65% of the United States population geographically. Response for volunteer departments depends on on-call member availability, which during weekday daytime hours frequently falls below minimum operational staffing, extending response further. The Camp Fire destroyed more than 18,000 structures. The Paradise Fire Department had approximately 20 full-time personnel serving 27,000 residents. The department's entire operational capacity was consumed by the first blocks affected. The community's survival or death was determined entirely by self-evacuation decisions made before the first engine arrived. American Fire Service funding is local, creating disparities in staffing, equipment, and response capability that track closely with property tax bases. Communities with lower tax revenues have longer response times, older equipment, and fewer personnel, a structural inequity with measurable mortality consequences. First responder accounts from major fire incidents consistently describe their role in the same terms: extracting people from spaces that retained survivability. They do not describe reversing conditions in rooms that had already been lost, because that is not a realistic operational capability. Survivors who were rescued by firefighters were found in spaces they had protected, behind closed doors, in bathrooms with blocked gaps, at windows where they were visible. Firefighters found the survivable spaces. The occupants created them. The fire department is coming. They are coming to find people in survivable spaces. Your job, for the 3 to 7 minutes before they arrive, is to still be in one. 13 decades of film and television have built a complete and confident visual grammar for what a building fire looks like from the inside. Orange glow, visible flames rolling along the ceiling at a navigable distance, smoke that is thick but not impenetrable, rising in a clear layer above head height. A dramatic but traversable environment where a motivated person can move purposefully toward an exit. Survivors who have been inside actual structure fires describe something categorically and completely different, and the gap between the cinematic image and the actual sensory environment of a burning building is one of the most consistently fatal mismatches in fire safety. The interior of a burning building is dark, not dim, dark. Black smoke from burning synthetic materials reduces visibility to near zero within seconds of room involvement. Fire investigators consistently document victims who navigated in incorrect directions, moving away from exits they knew, in smoke conditions that eliminated all visual reference in seconds. The familiar room you have walked through 1,000 times becomes an obstacle course you cannot see, and the mental map you relied on requires your eyes to function. Carbon monoxide reaches occupants before the smoke is heavy enough to navigate, producing a specific cognitive signature: subtle disorientation, fatigue, and confusion. that degrades the very decision-making capacity needed to compensate for the visual impairment. Thermal layering creates an intensely hot upper air zone and a cooler lower zone, but that gradient can reverse and supercharge across the entire room volume at flashover in a fraction of a second. Survivors describe it not as a gradual warming, but as instantaneous thermal shock. The Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston in 1942, which killed 492 people, produced documented survivor accounts of navigating entirely by touch, counting door frames, following walls, orienting by the physical geometry of a space they could no longer see. The brief period of intense illumination that occurs in the seconds before flashover, the only moment a fire's interior resembles the cinematic image, lasts seconds and then gives way to total involvement. Survivor training recommendations from multiple fire research institutions include memorizing exit paths by physical touch, counting door frames, knowing the tactile geography of escape routes, because the visual memory of where the exit is becomes useless in zero visibility smoke. The building you know becomes a building you cannot see. Your eyes stop working. Your map of the space is the only tool you have left, and if it only exists as visual memory, it is already gone. 14. Tear a strip of cloth, soak it, hold it over your mouth, and breathe through it while moving through smoke. The image is in every disaster film, every survival manual written before the 1990s, and still circulates on social media preparedness content as an actionable tip. The technique is not entirely without value, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. It does something visible and tactile that feels like solving the problem while the actual problem passes through it completely unaffected. What kills people in modern structure fires is primarily carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, gases, not particles. A wet cloth captures some particulate matter, specifically soot, and reduces the irritation from inhaling solid combustion debris. Soot irritation is real and uncomfortable. It is not the primary cause of rapid incapacitation and death. The gases are. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide are not particles. They do not stick to wet fabric. They do not cluster in visible smoke. They flow through a wet cloth at the same concentration as the surrounding air, without resistance, without filtration, without any meaningful reduction in exposure. A study published in the Journal of Hazardous Materials tested improvised smoke filters, including wet cloth configurations, in simulated fire atmosphere and found negligible reduction in carbon monoxide concentration at the breathing zone. Zero meaningful protection against the primary lethal agent. Military self-rescue protocols and OSHA guidance on contaminated atmosphere egress both explicitly identify improvised filtration as a last resort measure that must not be treated as equivalent to actual respiratory protection equipment. The specific danger of wet cloth is not that it does nothing. It is that it does enough to feel like something. Survivors who used wet cloth during escape attempts report that breathing felt easier, that they felt more capable, that they felt like the situation was being managed. They were experiencing reduced particulate irritation. Simultaneously, they were inhaling carbon monoxide at the same concentration as the surrounding atmosphere. The subjective improvement masked the objective physiological crisis. Carbon monoxide escape respirators, small, lightweight, rated for actual CO filtration, exist and are recommended in fire safety literature. They have almost zero penetration in public awareness or household preparedness. The wet cloth is a comfort measure dressed as a survival technique, and the confidence it provides is its most dangerous feature, because the gas you cannot taste or smell is flowing through it without interruption. 15. If the flames are distant, you have time. If the smoke is light and gray, you are in the early stages. If you can still see across the room, the situation is manageable. Human beings are visual creatures, and fire exploits that completely. The most lethal phases of a structure fire are entirely invisible to the naked eye, and the judgment calls people make, based on what they can see, are systematically wrong in ways that have been documented in fire investigations for decades. Hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, the compounds responsible for the majority of fire-related deaths in modern structure fires, are completely colorless and odorless at the concentrations present in a burning building. They are present in the atmosphere long before visible smoke becomes heavy, long before flame is visible in adjacent rooms, and in some smoldering fire scenarios, long before any visible fire signature exists at all. The process called pyrolysis, where materials off-gas combustible and toxic compounds under heat before they actually ignite, means a room can be producing lethal concentrations of toxic gases with no visible flame at all. The primary warning may be the chemical smell of burning plastic. The primary physiological effect is the onset of confusion, fatigue, and impaired judgment, which are also the symptoms that make correct assessment of the situation increasingly difficult. Thermal imaging cameras used by firefighters reveal temperature gradients, hot gas layers, and fire progression through structural materials that are completely invisible to human vision. Firefighters navigate a fundamentally different version of the fire environment than the occupants they are rescuing, one with instrumentation that compensates for the visual gap. Occupants have human eyes. In the Coconut Grove fire, eyewitness survivor accounts describe the transition from apparently manageable smoke to complete incapacitation taking under 2 minutes, with minimal visible fire progression visible during that interval. Post-fire investigation of multiple residential and commercial fire fatalities finds a consistent pattern in victim behavioral evidence. Indications of reduced or absent defensive behavior in individuals who were in spaces that appeared, by visual indicators, to have provided time to react. The visual environment had not significantly changed when the physiological emergency had already begun. Fire does not warn you by looking dangerous first. It gets lethal at the molecular level, while the room still looks navigable. By the time your eyes confirm the emergency has likely already started inside your lungs. 16. Fire has a smell. Everyone knows it from fireplaces and campfires. The assumption built on this is that a house fire would announce itself on the same sensory frequency. Something familiar, something the nose would catch early, something that would travel down the hallway and trigger a response before conditions became critical. This assumption is wrong in the most consequential way possible, because the most deadly component of a modern structure fire has no smell at all, and the fires produced by the synthetic materials filling contemporary homes smell nothing like a wood fire. Carbon monoxide is completely odorless and colorless. It is produced by incomplete combustion in virtually every structure fire. At the concentrations that accumulate in a burning residential structure, it has no sensory signature of any kind. There is nothing to smell. The nose is a completely irrelevant instrument for detecting the primary lethal compound in most residential fire deaths. Burning polyurethane foam, the material in most American sofas and mattresses, produces hydrogen cyanide, acrolein, and isocyanates. These compounds do not smell like wood smoke. They smell sharp, chemical, and electrical. Many people describe the odor of a burning synthetic home as smelling like a problem with the wiring or an overheated appliance, not as something they immediately identify as fire. Acrolein is a severe respiratory irritant at concentrations below what the nose reliably detects under stress. By the time the smell registers as a fire emergency rather than an odd household odor, the physiological process may already be underway. The familiar campfire smell, produced by burning cellulose, meaning wood, paper, and natural fiber, is decreasing in residential fire events as synthetic material has displaced natural material in virtually every category of home furnishing. Overnight residential fire deaths account for approximately half of all U.S. residential fire fatalities. In the vast majority of those cases, The carbon monoxide that incapacitated sleeping victims reached lethal concentrations before any smoke reached them at a concentration detectable by smell. The alarm is not a backup to the nose. It is the entire detection system. First responders consistently describe entering residential fires and finding victims who made no evacuation attempt despite fires that had been burning long enough to alert neighbors. A pattern consistent with CO incapacitation that preceded any heavy smoke smell in the victim's location. You cannot smell your way to safety in a modern structure fire. The device that detects what the nose cannot costs less than a dinner out. 17. Every major fire event that produces a mass casualty toll at the exits gets described the same way in initial media coverage. Panic. A panicking crowd. Irrational stampede. People overriding each other in a mindless survival frenzy. This narrative is emotionally satisfying. It fits the template of catastrophe storytelling, and it is largely wrong. A finding that fire behavior researchers have been documenting since the 1970s, with remarkably little penetration into public understanding or post-incident reporting. Sociologists who study crowd behavior in fire evacuations, specifically Lee Clark and John Drury, whose work has shaped modern emergency management, have found that the classic panic stampede behavior is exceptionally rare in documented fire evacuations. People in fire emergencies tend toward prosocial behavior. They help strangers. They hold doors. They wait their turn. They seek information before acting. The behavior that looks like panic from the outside is frequently rational individual decision-making under conditions of architectural failure and inadequate information. The Coconut Grove Fire in Boston in 1942 killed 492 people and was immediately characterized as a panic event. Post-investigation found inward opening doors that could not be forced open under crowd pressure, a revolving door that jammed immediately with the first crush of people, and a building operating at double its legal occupancy. The people were not irrational. They were trapped by doors that opened the wrong way in a building that should not have held them. The Station nightclub fire in 2003 produced a concentration of deaths at the single main entrance. Post-investigation documented that the entrance most people moved toward was the entrance they had used to enter. Familiar, visible, and trusted. Researchers call this exit familiarity bias. It is not irrational. It is the default navigation behavior of people in an unfamiliar building making rapid decisions with no better information available. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in 1977 killed 165 people in the cabaret room. Post-investigation found that management delayed announcing the evacuation long enough for the fire to advance to a point where all routes were simultaneously compromised. Crowds moved rationally toward exits. The exits were already failing. Modern fire egress design, door swing direction, exit width ratios, illuminated signage, stairwell pressurization exists specifically to compensate for predictable human behavior under stress. When those design elements are absent or have failed, people die. Blaming panic is how we avoid blaming the building. 18. The guideline exists in certain industrial and outdoor safety contexts. Wear natural fibers in high heat environments. Avoid synthetics if you are working near fire risk. Many people have absorbed a version of this as general wisdom. Cotton is safer than polyester. Natural materials are better than synthetics, and this knowledge is something to carry into any fire scenario. The principle has a real basis. The application most people carry is rough enough to be genuinely dangerous in the specific scenarios where clothing choice most directly affects survival outcomes. Cotton burns. It does not melt, which distinguishes it from polyester and nylon, but burning cotton produces different injuries than melting synthetics, not categorically safer ones. In a flash fire scenario, which includes wildfire front passage and fuel-related fires, The primary clothing injury mechanism with synthetic fabrics is melting and bonding to skin, producing burns that are more difficult to treat and more prone to severe infection than standard thermal burns. That distinction matters, and the preference for natural fibers in that context is real. But plain cotton does not meet NFPA 2112, the flame-resistant clothing standard for industrial flash fire protection. Neither does plain polyester. The standard requires engineered flame-resistant materials, Nomex, PBI, treated cotton. That the natural fibers are safer framing does not distinguish from untreated natural fabrics. Wool is the genuinely fire-resistant natural fiber. It is self-extinguishing, does not melt, and provides meaningful radiant heat protection. This specificity is completely lost in the general natural fibers are safer formulation, which most people interpret as cotton rather than wool. Moisture-wicking synthetic athletic wear, ubiquitous in outdoor recreation and increasingly worn during everyday activities in high fire risk regions, represents the worst-case clothing choice in a wildfire evacuation scenario. CAL FIRE explicitly warns against it. Post-burn injury data from the Carr Fire and Camp Fire documented clothing-related burns in individuals with limited direct flame exposure, where radiant heat from the approaching fire front was sufficient to begin melting synthetic fabric. Photographs of evacuation scenes from Lahaina and Paradise consistently show people wearing exactly the clothing that produces the worst outcomes. Denim provides reasonable radiant heat protection by virtue of weight and density. That practical guideline, wear jeans, not leggings, does not appear in official public guidance. Cotton is better than polyester. Wool is better than cotton. Flame-resistant fabric is better than all of them. And leggings in a wildfire evacuation are a medical problem waiting to happen. 19. The visual logic is compelling and feels like solid geometry. You are 2 or 3 floors up. The staircase is blocked. A lower roof or fire escape is visible from the window. The gap looks manageable. The instinct to bridge it feels rational. Movies and intuition converge on this one with unusual consistency. Get out of the building by whatever route is available, and the window to lower surface drop appears to be a route. The survivable drop height for an untrained person performing an uncontrolled fall is approximately 10 to 15 feet. Roughly 1 story in standard residential construction. Impact forces at 20 feet without injury mitigation produce damage to ankles, knees, hips, and the spine that frequently prevent the person from moving away from the landing zone, which is a significant problem if the landing zone is still adjacent to the burning structure. The correct drop technique, hanging from the windowsill by the fingertips to reduce the effective fall distance to 4 to 6 feet before release, requires maintaining a grip under stress, proper landing mechanics, and enough physical clearance to execute without catching the building edge. It reduces injury probability substantially compared to an uncontrolled drop, but requires a physical competence almost never practiced or discussed in fire safety contexts. Fire escapes represent a specific and underappreciated failure point. They are an aging infrastructure artifact, required by early 20th century codes, maintained at building owner discretion across decades of deferred maintenance cycles. OSHA and local inspection data regularly document significant percentages of inspected fire escapes with structural deficiencies. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in 1911, 146 dead, involved a fire escape that collapsed under occupant load. The defining legislative response to that fire explicitly established that fire escapes are secondary systems, not primary escape routes. Jumping to a lower roof requires accurate distance estimation under extreme stress and CO impairment, conditions that reliably degrade spatial perception in ways that are well documented. If shelter and signal is still an option, staying visible at a window, making noise, waiting for a ground ladder, it consistently produces better outcomes than an uncontrolled drop. Ground ladders reach 4 to 5 stories. The jump is irreversible. Waiting has additional chapters. The window is where you signal from while waiting for a ladder. The drop is the last sentence of a story you want to continue. 20. The green sign. The illuminated arrow. The universal visual grammar of safe egress. Exit signs represent one of the most deeply trusted safety infrastructure elements in modern occupied buildings. Trusted to the point where following the arrow is not a decision, it is a reflex. That trust is based on an assumption the signs do not make. Exit signs indicate the location of a door. They do not indicate the condition of what is beyond it. They were installed at occupancy. They have not updated, and they have no mechanism to reflect real-time conditions in the stairwell or corridor on the other side. The MGM Grand Hotel fire in Las Vegas in 1980 killed 85 people and produced documented accounts of guests following stairwell exit signs into shafts that were the primary smoke migration pathway through the building. The sign was correct. The door was an exit. The stairwell beyond it was not survivable at that moment. Following the sign led people into the worst possible route. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in 1977 produced 165 deaths in the cabaret room, despite an exit being present and signed. The combination of delayed warning delivery, simultaneous evacuation by over 1,200 occupants, and a single primary exit pathway created a fatal bottleneck that an accurate exit sign was powerless to prevent or redirect. Stairwell doors in high-rise buildings are frequently locked from the stairwell side, a security feature that becomes a lethal design failure in fire events. Occupants following exit signs enter stairwells and discover they cannot exit on an alternate floor when conditions in the stairwell change. The option of reversing course while impaired and in zero visibility is not always available. Emergency lighting systems that power exit signs are tested at minimum maintenance standards and experience failure rates that are meaningful in real fire scenarios where power disruption is among the first system failures. Post-fire investigations include exit sign legibility and emergency lighting function as standard review elements, because their failure at the moment of maximum demand is a recurring documented pattern. The NFPA code addresses these failure modes through cross-corridor communication, exit hierarchy signage, and stairwell door release systems, all present in new construction and major renovations, largely absent in the existing building stock where most fire deaths occur. The sign tells you where the door is. It does not tell you what is on the other side. Following the arrow is the beginning of a decision, not the end of it. 21. A persistent element of fire safety instruction for children focuses on behavioral correction, specifically the instruction not to hide under the bed or in closets during a fire. The framing treats hiding as the primary behavioral risk for children in fire scenarios, implies that correcting this instinct is the central preparedness task, and in doing so, absorbs instructional time and attention from the factors that actually account for the majority of child fire fatalities. The hiding behavior is real. It is a biologically appropriate fear response in a developing nervous system encountering smoke, heat, and an alarm. Concealment is what frightened children do, and it can create a rescue complication. It is not, however, the primary driver of child fire mortality in the United States. NFPA fire death data identifies children under 5 as one of the 2 highest risk demographic groups in residential fires. The common factor in that elevated risk is not behavioral, it is dependence. Children under 5 cannot initiate their own evacuation. Their survival is entirely contingent on an adult identifying the emergency and physically removing them. Children who are sleeping at fire onset are subject to the same carbon monoxide incapacitation pattern as adult deep sleepers. They do not hide because by the time hiding would be relevant, they are frequently already incapacitated. The hiding that does occur happens as a fear response to the alarm and smoke. The child is awake, is terrified, and does what frightened small children do. This is not a correctable behavioral failure. It is a consequence of a child-sized stress response to an adult-scale emergency. NFPA analyses of child fire fatalities consistently find that a significant percentage involve adult supervision failure, adults in another part of the structure, adults who evacuated and did not locate the child, adults who were themselves incapacitated. The evacuation initiation failure occurred at the adult level. Single-parent households, households with medically vulnerable caretakers, and households where adults may be incapacitated represent elevated child fire risk profiles that child behavioral instruction cannot address. NFPA fire safety training programs that include children, specifically the Learn Not to Burn program, show measurably better evacuation decision-making in trained versus untrained children in simulated scenarios. The training works. The penetration is inadequate. Teaching a child not to hide is useful. The biggest risk to a child in a house fire is being in a house where the alarm went off and no capable adult moved toward them. The behavioral correction misses the structural problem. 22. The air quality alert for wildfire smoke is treated by most healthy adults as a conditional suggestion. Close the windows if you have asthma. Stay inside if you are elderly or immunocompromised. Otherwise, a few days of orange-tinted skies and a persistent haze is understood as an inconvenience, unpleasant, worth monitoring, but not a medical event for a person who considers themselves healthy. This understanding reflects a significant gap between public perception of wildfire smoke and the documented physiological reality of what it contains and what it does. Wildfire smoke contains fine particulate matter, PM2.5, at concentrations that can exceed 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter during major fire events. The EPA's 24-hour exposure standard is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. The 2020 California fire season produced air quality index readings above 500, the maximum of the EPA scale, labeled hazardous, across large portions of the state for multiple consecutive days. Emergency departments during those events documented increased presentations for cardiovascular events, not only respiratory complaints, in individuals who had no prior cardiac history. Fine particles at this size penetrate into the alveoli and cross into the bloodstream, where they interact with cardiovascular function, inflammatory pathways, and neurological systems. Unlike urban PM 2.5, produced primarily by fossil fuel combustion, wildfire smoke carries byproducts of burning synthetic materials, pesticides, fire retardants, and a broad range of chemical compounds that are not present in urban particulate matter. The toxicological profile of wildfire smoke is distinct from the urban air pollution model that most public health guidance is calibrated to. Long-term studies following the 2001 World Trade Center collapse, the most thoroughly studied acute mass particulate exposure event in American history, documented pulmonary, cardiovascular, and neurological effects in exposed individuals who were considered healthy at the time of exposure. Indoor air quality during major wildfire events is not adequately protected by closing windows in standard residential construction. Fine particle infiltration through construction gaps can result in indoor concentrations 50 to 80% of outdoor levels. The Lahaina fire produced a smoke and combustion compound exposure involving vehicle fires, structural fires, vegetation, and infrastructure, a chemical mixture whose long-term health effects on survivors are actively being studied. The smoke that turned California's noon sky orange was not an inconvenience. It was a chemical exposure event breathed by tens of millions of people, most of whom treated it as weather. 23. The fire is out. You walked out. The medics looked you over, found no obvious injury, and you went home. The common understanding of fire survival ends at the door. The acute event is over, the danger has passed, and whatever comes next is recovery from property loss or emotional distress, not from ongoing physical threat. A meaningful and documented category of fire survival fatalities and serious medical events occur in the hours, days, and weeks following apparent escape from the building. The emergency was not over at the door. Hydrogen cyanide poisoning from fire exposure does not always produce immediate incapacitation. At sublethal concentrations, it causes cellular hypoxia, the inability of cells to use oxygen despite adequate blood oxygen levels, that presents subtly as confusion, fatigue, and headache. These symptoms resolve as exposure ends, but the cellular injury can produce delayed cardiac or neurological events hours after the person has left the building, has been assessed as ambulatory and oriented, and has been classified as uninjured. Smoke inhalation injury encompasses 3 distinct processes that occur on different timelines. Thermal injury to upper airways is typically apparent at initial evaluation. Chemical injury to lower airways from toxic gas exposure may not produce symptoms for 12 to 24 hours post-exposure. Systemic toxicity from carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide may present as a delayed event hours after exposure has ended. These are separate processes with separate timelines. An initial triage in a mass casualty fire event does not always capture the delayed presentations. The 2003 Station nightclub fire produced documented delayed onset deaths. Individuals who were ambulatory and communicating at the scene, who died hours or days later from pulmonary injury and systemic toxicity that initial triage had not identified. Post-traumatic stress disorder rates among structural fire survivors are documented at levels comparable to combat veterans and disaster first responders. Without active outreach and clinical support, a significant proportion develop chronic PTSD, depression, and substance use disorders that persist for years. Campfire survivor research, following residents of Paradise, California, years after the 2018 event, documented elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and trauma-related physical health conditions well beyond the immediate disaster period. Burn injuries, even relatively limited ones, require months of wound care, infection management, pain treatment, physical therapy, and frequently reconstructive surgery. The initial survival of a burn is not the resolution of the injury. Leaving the building is Chapter 1. The story of fire survival does not end at the door. 24. Older buildings are the dangerous ones. Outdated wiring, pre-code construction, no sprinklers, materials from an era before fire safety was systematically regulated. The instinct to distrust old buildings in a fire context is intuitive and widespread, and it produces a genuine paradox. Because in many categories of structural fire performance, older heavy timber and masonry construction outperforms modern lightweight engineered construction in ways that directly affect survivability, firefighter safety, and the time available between ignition and structural failure. Old-growth solid timber joists, common in pre-1940 construction, char predictably on the outside when exposed to fire. That char layer acts as thermal insulation for the interior wood, slowing heat penetration and maintaining load-bearing capacity for extended periods. Fire engineers call this fire endurance. It is a measurable property, and legacy heavy timber construction has a substantial amount of it. Masonry construction, brick, concrete block, provides inherent compartmentalization that modern wood frame construction does not approximate. Fire spread between units in historic masonry. Apartment buildings is substantially slower than in modern wood frame multifamily construction, where shared wall assemblies and lightweight structural components create rapid propagation pathways. Modern engineered lumber achieves identical load-bearing specifications at a fraction of the material weight and cost. The failure mode under fire conditions is completely different. The adhesives that hold I-joists, laminated beams, and parallel strand lumber components together fail at temperatures below wood ignition, approximately 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The structural member does not char and hold. It fails suddenly, completely, and without the progressive warning signs that characterize legacy timber failure. The National Institute of Standards and Technology documented lightweight wood frame floor failure in as little as 6 minutes of fire exposure. Legacy solid timber floors held for 18 to 20 minutes under comparable conditions. NFPA and Underwriters Laboratories have issued specific safety advisories for firefighters operating in post-1980 lightweight construction, noting compressed safe operating windows. No equivalent advisories exist for legacy timber construction. Electrical systems are the legitimate vulnerability of older buildings. Knob and tube wiring, inadequate grounding, overloaded circuits, and retrofitting these systems provides genuine safety value. But electrical vulnerability is separate from structural fire performance. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory building, a legacy loft construction, still stands over a century after the fire that killed 146 people inside it. The building was not the failure mechanism. Old does not mean dangerous. New does not mean safe. 25. The operational assumption for most residents of high wildfire risk communities is that fire gives visual warning. You will see the smoke column building. You will smell the air shift. You will observe the orange horizon and have time to respond. The assumption is reasonable. It is also the reason so many people die in fast-moving wildfire events. Not because they lacked the instinct to leave, but because the information model they used to decide when to leave was calibrated to a timeline that extreme wildfire conditions do not provide. The campfire moved through Paradise, California at approximately 80 football fields per minute at peak advance. The Lahaina fire crossed downtown Lahaina in under 2 hours under wind conditions exceeding 60 miles per hour. In both events, the fire's ground-level advance was not intuitive from smoke column observation. Smoke was visible. The rate of surface fire spread was not. Ember transport is the primary wildfire spread mechanism in wind-driven events. Firebrands, burning embers, can travel up to a mile ahead of the main fire front and ignite separate fires with no visual connection to the fire most people are watching. The fire appearing in front of you, with the main fire still behind you, has no early warning built into it. It simply arrives. Wind-driven fires create a smoke shadow effect. The wind carries smoke rapidly away from observers in the fire's path, so a person standing directly in the path of an approaching fire may experience relatively clear air and limited smoke odor until the fire front is very close. CAL FIRE community research found that residents of high-risk zones consistently overestimate the warning interval they will receive in a fast-moving event, and significantly underestimate the time required to evacuate their specific road network under traffic conditions. The ember intrusion pathway, firebrands entering structures through vents, eaves gaps, and construction openings, and igniting interior fires, means a structure can be burning from the inside, while the main fire front is still a significant distance away. This mechanism was extensively documented in post-fire engineering surveys of Paradise and Santa Rosa after the 2017 Tubbs fire. The U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE both document that leaving at the first watch notification, before mandatory evacuation order, is the highest survival individual behavioral action in wildfire events. At mandatory order, the window has frequently already narrowed. By the time it looks like a fire from your driveway, you may have already missed your exit. 26. The cultural image of fire heroism is emotionally central to how these events get told. The neighbor who ran back in, the stranger who carried someone out, the person who went back for the dog. These stories are real. They generate the survivor accounts that get repeated, and they carry an implicit message that reentry rescue is a viable response to a fire emergency. It is also one of the most consistently documented causes of preventable fire fatalities in residential settings. And the version of the story where the person goes back in and does not come back out rarely generates a survivor account, for the obvious reason. NFPA fire investigation data includes a recurring category of fatalities classified as attempted reentry, people who confirmed their own escape and then returned to rescue a person or animal and died in the attempt. This is not rare. It is a documented, recurring pattern across residential fire investigations spanning multiple decades. The physiological conditions that incapacitate victims inside a burning structure, carbon monoxide poisoning, respiratory injury, thermal incapacitation, do not distinguish between the person being rescued and the person attempting the rescue. An untrained civilian entering a structure without respiratory protection in active fire conditions faces the same incapacitation timeline as the person they are attempting to reach. There is no protective adrenaline override for carbon monoxide. Firefighters are trained specifically for interior rescue, equipped with self-contained breathing apparatus, operating in teams with accountability systems and radio contact, using thermal imaging to navigate zero visibility spaces. Even with that equipment and training, interior operations in structural fires represent the highest line-of-duty death risk in the American Fire Service. The survival window for a civilian reentry rescue, the window in which a non-firefighter entering a burning structure can extract a living person and exit safely, is narrow at the moment of decision and closing rapidly. Post-flashover reentry is not a rescue operation. The recommended protocol produces the best survival probability. Provide the victim's precise location to the first arriving firefighter. Describe the space. Describe the person. Do not re-enter. The instinct to go back is not a character flaw. It is the most human possible response to an impossible situation. The fire does not grade on intention. The window for the civilian rescue and the window for dying in the attempt are the same window. 27. When a fire department arrives at your address, there is a reasonable working assumption that they know something about the building, its layout, where the stairwells are, where the water supply is, where high-risk occupants might be located. The assumption that professional responders have pre-established situational knowledge about the structures they protect shapes how people think about their own responsibility to prepare and communicate during an emergency. The reality of pre-fire planning coverage in the United States is substantially more limited than this assumption, and the gap has direct operational consequences for outcomes. Formal pre-fire planning, site surveys that document building layout, access points, hazardous material locations, and occupant information, is conducted for commercial, industrial, and institutional structures in most jurisdictions. Single-family residential buildings and low-rise multifamily housing are typically not formally pre-planned. In jurisdictions where residential data exists, it is updated on permit cycles, meaning that renovations, room use changes, and structural modifications that occur without permits, an extremely common pattern, are not reflected in fire department records. Response to residential fires relies primarily on arrival observation. The incident commander assesses the building from the exterior, identifies the visible fire location, and makes tactical decisions based on architectural inference and visible indicators. This is skilled improvisation by trained professionals. It is not pre-planned knowledge. Large apartment complexes with multiple identical wings and limited exterior unit identification create specific tactical challenges where first arriving units must determine building orientation before committing to a search pattern. Concealed space fires, burning inside wall cavities, attic assemblies, or floor systems without obvious exterior manifestation require knowledge of construction type, framing configuration, and insulation materials to approach correctly. That information is rarely available on arrival. The NFPA and fire service training institutions consistently identify resident-provided information as among the most valuable inputs to an initial fire response. The floor and unit of origin, the number of occupants, who may be unable to self-evacuate, and any specific access challenges. A resident standing on the lawn who can deliver that information to the first arriving officer, provides intelligence that the response system does not otherwise have. The engine pulls up. The captain knows your address. Everything else is assessment under fire conditions. The most useful thing you can tell the first firefighter is where it started and who might still be inside. 28. The inspection happened. The building passed. There is a certificate documenting compliance. The assumption that follows from that certificate is that it represents a condition of safety that persists until the next inspection, a status rather than a moment in time. This assumption is how the interval between inspections becomes a window of progressive, undetected risk accumulation that is invisible to the certification system until something ignites it. Fire inspection cycles are measured in years. Building conditions change in days. Exit corridors accumulate storage. Sprinkler heads get painted over during renovation. Electrical panels receive additional circuits without load assessment. Fire doors get propped open because the self-closing mechanism is inconvenient. None of these changes happen at inspection. Most of them do not happen dramatically enough to prompt anyone to report them. They happen incrementally, invisibly, and cumulatively, and they transform a compliant building into a non-compliant one without triggering any notification to the certification system. The ghost ship warehouse fire in Oakland, California in 2016 killed 36 people in a converted event space that had been the subject of prior complaints and at least one inspection visit. The building's transformation into a venue housing hundreds of people had occurred through informal, incremental accumulation of furniture, materials, and occupancy changes, the exact pattern that periodic inspection cycles are structurally unable to detect. Sprinkler system maintenance failures, clogged heads, obstructed coverage from stored materials, degraded water supply pressure, develop between inspections through gradual deterioration. Exit path obstruction is among the most common violations found at commercial inspection and among the fastest to recur after correction because it is driven by ongoing storage pressure that does not disappear when a clipboard visit ends. The One Meridian Plaza fire in Philadelphia in 1991 burned for 19 hours in a modern, code-compliant high-rise. Compliance at time of inspection does not represent continuous safety condition when system maintenance diverges from inspected state. Self-inspection by building occupants, a walkthrough of exit paths, fire door condition, sprinkler head clearance, alarm functionality, is not legally required and is almost never practiced in residential or small commercial settings. It is the only tool that operates on a timeline shorter than the inspection cycle. The inspection certificate is a snapshot. The building is a film. Everything changes between frames, and nobody is watching the footage. 29. The survivors versus victims narrative in mass fire events consistently resolves into the language of luck, randomness, and fate. The person who lived was in the right seat. The person who died was in the wrong corridor. There was no meaningful behavioral difference. It was position and chance. And if it had been you instead of them, you might have done exactly the same thing and died too. This narrative is understandable. It is also incomplete in ways that have direct practical consequences for anyone who wants to not be the person in the wrong corridor. Post-fire behavioral analysis consistently identifies decision patterns that stratify survivors from victims independent of physical position at fire origin. The University of Greenwich Fire Research Group, examining survivor behavior across multiple mass casualty fire events, found that survivors made faster initial evacuation decisions. They did not wait for confirmation signals, a second alarm activation, visible fire, or other people beginning to move before initiating their own movement toward an exit. The sociological concept of milling, seeking information from others before acting in an emergency, has been studied in evacuation research across multiple decades. Extended milling is associated with delayed evacuation and consistently worse outcomes. Survivors mill less. They move on incomplete information with greater speed. Pre-event familiarity with exits, specifically having consciously noted secondary exit locations upon entering a building, is associated with significantly faster and more accurate exit selection in simulated emergency scenarios. This is what the airline safety briefing is attempting to accomplish. Most people do not consciously execute it in any building they enter. Campfire survivor research found that residents who had pre-established family communication plans, prepared evacuation go-kits, and mentally pre-committed to early evacuation before a mandatory order survived at meaningfully higher rates than demographically similar residents without those preparations. The behavioral variable existed before the fire started. It was the decision about what they would do, made in advance, that determined whether they used their exit window or spent it resolving the decision under fire conditions. Fire safety training completion is associated with faster evacuation decision-making, more accurate route selection, and lower panic response in simulated fire scenarios. The training effect is measurable. Survivors frequently describe their own escape as lucky. They mean it sincerely. Investigators who study survivors and victims together find the behavioral differentiators that survivors themselves do not see. The luck narrative comes from survivor self-report. The data tells a more actionable story. 30. Wildfire is a Western United States phenomenon. California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado. The annual rhythm of fire season, evacuation orders, and air quality alerts is understood as a regional story that people in the eastern half of the country follow in the news and do not personally plan for. This geographic assumption is increasingly disconnected from the actual distribution of wildfire risk, and the communities operating under it have spent the least time and institutional capacity preparing for a hazard that is expanding into their terrain. The USDA Forest Service's 2023 Wildland-Urban Interface Risk Analysis found that the eastern United States contains the largest absolute number of homes in the wildland-urban interface nationally, not western states. The East, driven by high population density in forested suburban and exurban areas across the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Great Lakes regions. These communities have not developed wildfire evacuation culture, fire-resistant construction codes, or institutional response infrastructure commensurate with the risk profile they now occupy. The Gatlinburg, Tennessee fire in 2016 killed 14 people and destroyed over 2,400 structures in a community with no significant wildfire history or preparedness culture. The fire moved under wind-driven conditions through terrain that eastern residents and emergency managers had not modeled as wildfire capable. Eastern fire departments generally carry less wildland fire training, fewer wildland-rated apparatus, and less interagency coordination capacity for extended wildfire events than western departments. A resource distribution that reflects historical risk and is no longer aligned with current conditions. Building codes in eastern wildland-urban interface communities frequently do not include the fire-resistant construction requirements that western states have added through hard experience. Ember-resistant venting, non-combustible deck construction, Class A roof coverings. The construction that is burning in eastern fire events is the construction that western states were building before the fires taught them what changes to make. Invasive plant species have altered fuel load characteristics in eastern forest ecosystems. Kudzu and other fast-burning invasives create fire behavior more intense and more rapid than the native vegetation patterns that historical fire risk assessments were based on. The 2023 Nova Scotia wildland fires produced significant smoke events across the northeastern United States, a visible demonstration of cross-border fire impact on a region that does not culturally identify with fire risk. Wildfire is not a California problem that occasionally appears in your newsfeed. The fire does not care which time zone it is in. 31, the survivor of a serious fire, has something no preparedness brochure can replicate: direct, first-hand experience of what a fire actually is. The assumption that follows is intuitive. Experience creates expertise, and a person who has been through a fire is better equipped to respond to the next one. This assumption misses a specific and well-documented way that fire survival works against preparedness rather than for it. Post-traumatic stress disorder following fire events produces characteristic cognitive and behavioral patterns that directly compromise future fire response. Hypervigilance, constant alarm checking, difficulty sleeping, inability to be in enclosed spaces, and avoidance, emotional shutdown around fire-related content, inability to engage with preparedness information, both impair the functional preparedness that the survivor experience should have enhanced. These are not character weaknesses. They are documented trauma responses that affect a significant portion of major fire survivors. Alarm fatigue, the desensitization to alarm signals from prior false alarm experience, or emotional overload, is paradoxically more pronounced in some fire survivors whose previous experience has altered their alarm response baseline. The cognitive template created by surviving a specific fire, last time I had time to do this, may be precisely wrong for a different fire in a different structure under different conditions. Surviving one fire builds confidence in a specific set of actions that may not generalize to the next event. The variability in fuel load, construction type, ignition source, and environmental conditions between fire events is substantial, and the operational knowledge from one event can actively mislead decision-making in another. Campfire and Tubbs fire survivor research documented that meaningful percentages of survivors experienced ongoing mental health challenges 2 to 3 years post-event that compromised their ability to engage in community rebuilding, process risk information, or participate in preparedness activities. The precise population that high-risk communities most need to be functionally prepared. Community fire preparedness organizations in California document a consistent phenomenon among residents who rebuilt and returned to fire-prone areas. Preparedness behavior, home hardening, defensible space maintenance, early evacuation commitment, declines over time relative to new residents, attributed to normalization of risk through the survival experience itself. Effective survivor-informed preparedness programs address this directly, providing psychological support that allows survivors to process their experience and extract generalizable knowledge rather than re-experience the specific event. Surviving a fire does not make you an expert on fire. It makes you an expert on that fire. The next one is a different exam, and having passed the last one can make you less likely to study. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.